Hello, everyone, and welcome to Food Safety Matters, the podcast for food safety professionals. I'm Stacey Atchison, publisher of Food Safety Magazine, and I'm joined by Adrienne Bloom, our editorial director, and Bailey Henderson, our content strategist and editor, who many of you know from our year-end review episodes. Bob Ferguson is on vacation this week, so he'll be back. I was going to say you'll see him, but you'll hear him next time. But we keep talking about it. We talk about it all the time, having Bailey on other episodes other than the year end. So we finally did it. So yay. Welcome, Bailey.
Thanks.
So,
thanks for letting us pull you away from your PC screen and keyboard for a little bit, Bailey. We know you're constantly typing. So
yeah.
Yes. See, that's the typing sound that you hear at the end of the that's all of us getting back to work.
Bailey
if you ever wonder what that sound is, it's all of us going, okay, now back to our day jobs. All right. So Adrienne, do you want to get us started by telling us a little bit about today's interview guest?
So in today's interview, exposure scientist and toxicologist Dr. Alex LeBeau explains how contaminant testing, exposure assessment, and risk assessment work together, and why detecting a substance in food doesn't necessarily indicate a health risk, with discussions around Florida's testing for arsenic in candy as an example. And we also talk about what regulators and industry need to know to interpret food contaminant findings responsibly. So make sure to tune in.
All right. Excellent, as always. So today is a no-frills episode. No frills from me anyway. So let's get right to it.
Yeah, okay. So first up in our news lineup today, infant formula has been in the news more or less constantly lately, it seems like, and new developments are shedding light on the recent infant botulism outbreaks linked to powdered infant formula, which may have significant implications for how the industry detects and manages Clostridium botulinum risk. So first, ByHeart has announced the development of a new C. botulinum-specific testing protocol after research commissioned by the company found that the industry's long-standing screening approach may not be sufficient for powdered infant formula. The findings stem from a study published in Frontiers in Microbiology, where researchers concluded that sulfite-reducing Clostridia, or SRC, enumeration, which has long been recommended by the International Commission on Microbiological Specifications for Foods as a general indicator of spore contamination, may not reliably detect the presence of C. botulinum in powdered infant formula. So according to ByHeart, the newly developed protocol is approximately 1,000 times more sensitive than SRC enumeration and was created in collaboration with an independent laboratory. The company said it has already shared the method with FDA and other infant formula manufacturers in an effort to encourage broader adoption across the industry. This research follows FDA's investigation into the 2025 ByHeart outbreak, which sickened 48 infants across 17 states before the outbreak was declared over in February of this year. So during that investigation, FDA detected C. botulinum in a powdered whole milk ingredient and matched isolates recovered from a Dairy Farmers of America processing facility to isolates found in both an affected infant and a finished ByHeart formula sample. However, FDA says it still hasn't identified the root cause of contamination or determined exactly how the organism entered the supply chain. Until these outbreaks, C. botulinum had generally not been considered a hazard reasonably likely to occur in powdered infant formula manufacturing.
Yeah, and that FDA announcement comes as investigators continue examining a second infant botulism outbreak involving Nara Organics whole milk organic powdered infant formula, which has hospitalized 4 infants in 3 states. While product testing remains ongoing and no definitive source of contamination has been identified, investigators have uncovered a notable connection between the 2 outbreaks. According to industry sources who spoke to Food Safety Magazine, both ByHeart and Nara Organics sourced organic whole milk from Organic West that was spray-dried into powdered whole milk at a Dairy Farmers of America facility in Fallon, Nevada, during overlapping periods between October 2024 and April 2025. Although Nara had transitioned to a European dairy supplier before the June 2026 outbreak was identified, formula manufactured with the earlier U.S.-sourced powdered milk remained on the market after details of the ByHeart outbreak became public. The shared supplier has intensified scrutiny of powdered whole milk as a potential vehicle for C. botulinum spores, Botulinum spores can survive conventional pasteurization and the spray drying process used to produce milk powder. FDA previously warned the infant formula industry in a 2023 call to action letter that whole milk powder should be considered a potential source of contamination, but neither FDA regulations nor prevailing industry practices require direct testing for C. botulinum in powdered infant formula. Instead, manufacturers have generally relied on SRC enumeration as an indirect indicator of spore contamination. The Nara outbreak also raises questions about the effectiveness of that approach. Prior to the recall, the company promoted its use of SRC testing at specifications 10 times more stringent than those recommended by the International Commission on Microbiological Specifications for Foods. But those protocols didn't detect contamination in ingredients, manufacturing processes, or finished product before infants became ill, supporting concerns that SRC enumeration alone may not adequately protect against C. botulinum contamination in powdered formula. FDA said there's currently insufficient evidence to conclude that the shared milk supplier or processing facility is a source of contamination in the Nara outbreak, as the investigation remains ongoing. The agency has also confirmed that inspections conducted at the European manufacturing facilities producing Nara formula identified deficiencies, although both manufacturers have submitted corrective action responses that remain under FDA review. So,
yeah. Well, first of all, and all transparency here, we were like checking our notes as we were getting through this story, going, "Is it how many states and because we've just added another illness? Was that right today? It went to 4.
Yeah, it was I think yesterday or today. The days blend together, but
they are blending right now. Yeah.
Yeah, FDA also announced that the California Department of Public Health detected Clostridium botulinum in a opened can of formula from one of the sickened babies' homes. So that's another important development along with the additional illness.
Well, and when I was, reading all this stuff over, the more sensitive testing really got my attention. But then it said that then we get to, SRC enumeration alone may not adequately protect against it. So I feel like, we're back, right?
Yeah.
So it makes me wonder where we really are.
I think that what we know still leaves a lot of questions because, we do know that at one point there was that spray-dried milk powder at that Fallon, Nevada plant that was spray-dried by the Dairy Federation of America. And that was supplied to both Nara Organics and ByHeart. That was a short window of time, but I think it's interesting that originally, I believe the supplier of the ingredient, which was Organics West, they had supplied FDA with a list of places where that ingredient was sent, and they accidentally left off Nara. And they told FDA that now as they're investigating this Nara outbreak. But, it seems like the transparency along the supply chain is not really great here. And that, of course, makes, trace back and trace forward, as FDA has been employing in this outbreak investigation. It makes it more difficult. And then, knowing that in the Nara outbreak, they're also looking at the facility in Germany that supplied some of the ingredients for the powdered infant formula, and they found some problems at that plant too. So there's multiple, I think, points where there could be, issues here. And then also I think it's interesting that when we're talking about, with the botulinum being detected in an open can and from a household, Bob is always very quick to say that, like, when you have open product from a household that you're testing, that cannot be 100% proof because we know that organisms can get into the environment. And it's interesting because that's actually something that we'll be talking about on the next episode, which is dropping on July 28th. And I'm doing a deep dive on infant formula and donor milk safety with Elena Meadow, who's the founder of Leonie Health, PBC. And in that interview, we're going to focus on the 2026 cerealide contamination crisis as an example. But we're also talking about these outbreaks that we're discussing here with ByHeart and Nara and, and also going back to the Abbott outbreak with Chronobacter. So, looking at these different organisms and looking at the different contamination pathways and how can formula and milk processors avoid these problems. So that's a really interesting interview. So I definitely recommend you tune in on the 28th for our next episode too.
Yeah, hopefully gets some more, the testing thing and having a methodology and knowing that you can have confidence, right? That's a huge piece for everybody, for manufacturers, suppliers, consumers, knowing that we've gotten to the bottom of these things.
Okay, so next up in news, USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service has announced a new pilot program that will evaluate alternative approaches to controlling salmonella in raw poultry slaughter and processing establishments. The pilot is part of the agency's continued effort to develop science-based strategies following the withdrawal of its proposed salmonella regulatory framework in 2025. The voluntary pilot is open to chicken and turkey establishments that are already subject to one or more existing salmonella performance standards. To participate, facilities must either implement salmonella biomapping throughout their operations or include a validated salmonella critical control point in their HACCP plan. One of the primary goals of the pilot is to evaluate a shorter, more responsive moving window for assessing compliance with salmonella performance standards. Instead of the current 52-week evaluation period, participating establishments would initially be assessed using a 13-week moving window that could expand to a maximum of 52 weeks. FSIS will also consider requests from participating establishments for alternative carcass microbial sampling frequencies through the agency's Salmonella Initiative program. Facilities participating through the biomapping option will be required to submit a sampling plan identifying the facility locations where salmonella will be routinely collected and enumerated. Those who are participating through the critical control point option must demonstrate that their salmonella intervention has been scientifically validated and incorporated into their HACCP systems. Existing biomapping and validated critical control point programs are also eligible to participate. According to FSIS, data collected through the pilot will help the agency evaluate the effectiveness of these control strategies and could inform future regulatory and policy decisions aimed at reducing salmonella illnesses associated with raw poultry products, which is something that's been a big topic of discussion ever since that proposal was withdrawn last year.
Yeah. So I drilled down. There are 4 companies right now that are participating in this, and I wondered if they were trying to get to more, or if there was, in other things there was some information that said that they maxed it out at 20, but so I hope that 4 facilities is enough for statistically valid results here. So I guess watch this space.
Yeah, and I mean, since they're also inviting facilities that already do the biomapping or have a validated CCP to participate, you could have those folks who probably already have a pretty good process in place there, along with the folks who are saying like, okay, we're going to do this new as part of the program participation. And so I think that could yield an interesting mix of data, but it would definitely be good to see more than 4 facilities joining this effort, since we can't really seem to get salmonella in poultry right yet. Yeah. So, there's some new things happening, new tries at tackling that, and hopefully more of industry will participate so that we could nail down some of the factors that go into this.
Yeah. So I was trying to figure out like what's the benefit to people, like to open up their doors and say, other than, wanting to help, is there anything in it for them? And I guess that's the difference between the 52 and the 13-week window, which would help them get product out faster. Is that did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, I'm assuming that's what that means.
Yeah. Okay.
So let's turn to Europe now. So in European news, the European Commission has published its 2025 annual report on the Alert and Cooperation Network, providing a snapshot of the year's most significant food safety hazards, emerging trends, and multinational incidents across Europe. The network processed a record of 10,490 notifications in 2025, which was an 11% increase over the previous year, which reflects both expanded surveillance and continued food safety challenges across global supply chains. So among food products, fruits and vegetables generated the most notifications, with pesticide residues accounting for nearly 60% of reports, particularly for non-EU imported product. Mycotoxins, especially aflatoxins, remain the leading hazard in nuts and seeds, while salmonella continued to be a major concern in poultry and meat products. The report also highlighted persistent issues involving listeria in fish and seafood, chemical migration from food contact materials, and fraudulent or non-compliant food supplements, many of which were sold through online marketplaces. The Commission also reviewed several of the year's most significant international food safety events. One was the multinational Listeria monocytogenes outbreak linked to pasteurized cows and goat milk cheeses produced in France. This outbreak sickened 21 people, resulted in 2 deaths, and led to recalls affecting products distributed under multiple brands in 65 countries. Investigators concluded the contamination most likely occurred during cheese production rather than in the raw milk. Another major incident involved the global recall of cerealide contaminated infant formula, as we'll discuss in that July 28th episode that I teased earlier. So investigators traced the cerealide contamination to arachidonic oil imported from China and supplied to multiple infant formula manufacturers, which affected 99 countries and territories and led to recalls across more than 60 countries. In addition to new cerealide safety thresholds for infant formula, the incident prompted new EU emergency import controls as well. The report also highlighted the multinational Salmonella Strathcona outbreak linked to tomatoes produced in Sicily, which caused more than 400 illnesses across Europe, as well as cases in the UK, Canada, and the US. Environmental sampling ultimately identified the outbreak strain in irrigation water, reinforcing the importance of agricultural water management and fresh produce safety. Overall, the European Commission said the report underscores the growing importance of international surveillance and rapid information sharing as regulators respond to microbiological and chemical hazards, food fraud, and increasingly complex food supply chains.
Well, it is interesting taking a look at what's, Europe as opposed to, what we're so familiar with here in the U.S. One of the things that caught my attention, because I guess, I don't hear about listeria in fish and seafood a lot. It doesn't seem like something that we cover a lot. So that one kind of popped out at me as different from some of the trends that we see here. But I'm sure, lots to take a look at and compare and contrast.
So one of the things that stood out in the report to me was just, a little bit unusual about that outbreak of listeria in cows and goats' milk cheeses produced in France, because the investigation found that, the milk was pasteurized, right? And then it was used to make cheese. They found that the contamination most likely occurred during cheese production. So, then you've got listeria in the cheese making plant, but it came from pasteurized milk, which, you think like, oh, well, pasteurization destroys listeria. And it does. But then if you get it into a plant that has, is making cheese and you've got listeria there, then you're going to have a big problem. So, yeah, I mean, we worry about raw milk here in the United States and, kind of people pushing that and saying, oh, it's healthier and all this stuff. And there's a million reasons that the CDC and the FDA keep throwing at people as to why you should not drink raw milk and eat raw dairy. But in this case, you would think, oh, you're safe because the milk is pasteurized and then the cheese was made from the milk. But, again, 2 people died and at least 21 people got sick because there was something wrong at the cheese making plant. So
the report itself underlined that, quote, as contamination of cheeses made from pasteurized milk is less common, such consumption is not discouraged for pregnant women, young children, the elderly, or immunocompromised. So that just makes the stakes a little bit higher because these populations aren't expecting their pasteurized milk products to get them sick. But yeah, the report also did outline that this contamination can happen during production, even post-pasteurization, due to the presence of listeria in the environment. So that's that.
But it sounds like even the report even acknowledges that this is a little bit of a freak, unusual thing that happened. So yeah,
cool. And I'm excited about this next one here because it will put an end to some of my ongoing confusions.
All right. Yeah. So before we go today, we want to let you know that a new California food labeling law is now in effect, and that makes the state the first in the nation to standardize consumer-facing date labels on packaged foods. So, beginning with products manufactured on or after July 1st of this year, companies selling packaged foods in California may only use the phrases "best if used by" or "best if used or frozen by" to indicate product quality, and the statements "used by" or "freeze by" to indicate food safety. So consumer-facing sell-by dates, along with other ambiguous terms like expires on or freshest by, are now prohibited to reduce confusion and unnecessary food waste. So, as we said, the law applies to packaged foods manufactured on or after July 1st, but it doesn't require manufacturers to add date labels where none previously existed. It also retains California's requirement that refrigerated packaged foods have a shelf life of no more than 30 calendar days from packaging to consumption, or the original safety date, whichever comes first. So I think since California represents such a large consumer market, the new labeling requirements will influence packaging practices well beyond the state. Manufacturers are going to have to look at whether they want to adopt the standardized terminology nationwide, which is probably the better course, or if they want to make separate products for the California marketplace, which is a little more complicated. Right.
But I mean, I don't even know how many times I've done that calculate. Well, sell by. Well, let's see. What does that mean?
I find it confusing too, even as, as a consumer, but as someone who works in this industry and understands more than maybe the average, food consumer would. I still find it confusing when I see, a sell by and then something else. And I don't know.
And the fact that they acknowledge that statements like best by or quality. So I'm glad that they go through and really, point out use by as opposed to best by.
Yeah. I want to see, as a person who is really paranoid about food spoiling, even one day past its quote unquote expiration date, I want to see use by dates. Because when I see sell by, and especially if it's something that's, prone to spoilage, it can spoil quickly. That makes me nervous because I would be that person who would be contributing to food waste by throwing out food. If the sell by date, if I feel like, it's 1 or 2 days past, so maybe that means it's not good anymore. And then, it probably was completely fine. So, yeah.
On the other hand, you have me that because I know so much about the sell by, used by, microbial pathogens and spoilage and stuff, I'll look at the used by date and go,
fine.
And then I'm like, one day this is probably going to come back and bite me. But
I won't throw it out till it starts growing mold, right?
Or it'll be like, oh, the milk's still good. Yeah,
well,
and then you take a sip and it's not.
It's like, the smell if by, can be applied. I find that it works pretty well on lettuce too. It's like arugula takes on a whole other thing.
Smell by date.
When it's this.
I'm interested to see if the rest of the country follows suit though, because as it usually happens, where California goes, everybody else follows. And I've seen on comments and stuff on this story and social media, mostly supportive. Probably because our audience is mostly in food safety, but I've seen only a couple of comments about the costs for manufacturers and whatnot. But if California might be just setting a new standard for the country, we'll see.
I mean, I imagine there's some cost involved with changing the way they label things, but I mean. Anyway.
Yeah.
So, there's always someone that's got a problem with something. I've come to accept
it's certainly not as much of a cost as, for example, updating your allergen labeling. That's what you call an expensive, but necessary
or
change.
Formulating.
So, yes, exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
All of which we've been discussing that we realize and we acknowledge absolutely that food manufacturers have a ton of things being thrown at them right now, especially in the US when, these things are changing so quickly here. So we're absolutely not belittling or, undermining what food manufacturers have to go through. But, I feel like changing the way that you specify what the food quality and safety dates on packaged foods
doesn't seem to be the heaviest lift that we've got.
Exactly. Yeah, you put it really well.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you both. So as always, there are links to all the articles that we've referenced in our show notes. And if you don't already, we invite you to follow us on our social channels, curated expertly by our own Bailey Henderson. Those are LinkedIn, X, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Definitely check out our YouTube channel. We're adding more and more stuff to that all the time. And we've recently started putting up some of our past webinars on there. So that's real helpful. So check it out. Food Safety Magazine everywhere you get stuff. And to take a deeper dive into all the great content that we offer, visit our website, food-safety.com. And while you're there, register for a free membership. This will give you unlimited access to our website, and a free subscription to our Food Safety Digest, our twice-weekly newsletter that keeps you up to date on news and Food Safety Magazine feature articles, videos, podcasts, and monthly webinars, aka everything. So do that. And now it's time for Adrian's interview with Dr. Alex LeBeau, owner of Exposure Assessment Consulting in Orlando, Florida, where he offers toxicology, industrial hygiene, risk assessment, and public health consulting services. Over his 13-year career, he has evaluated environmental and occupational exposures and has performed toxicological evaluations of chemicals and biological agents. He's also performed human health risk assessments of contaminated sites using U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and state regulatory guidelines, and has monitored remediation activities at those sites. To evaluate the exposure of impacts on building occupants, he's performed indoor environmental quality assessments, including Legionella and water quality assessments at healthcare, residential, and industrial facilities. Dr. LeBeau has been a co-author on industry guidance for COVID-19 issues. He's also been retained as a testifying expert witness and provided consultation on several occupational and environmental exposure claims. Finally, Dr. LeBeau has authored safety assessments on consumer products, including antimicrobial pesticide registration dossiers, generally recognized as safe or GRAS determinations for food ingredients, following FDA regulations for scientific procedures, and submitted a health claim petition for the FDA that was successfully accepted by the agency. All right, and with absolutely no ado, here's their discussion.
Well, recent reporting on Florida's arsenic testing in candy has raised questions about how contaminant data are generated, interpreted, and communicated to the public. So here with me today is Dr. Alex LeBeau, an exposure scientist and toxicologist, to examine the scientific context behind these findings and what may be missing from the current discussion. So welcome to the podcast, Alex. It's great to have you here.
I appreciate you having me.
So you have nearly 2 decades of experience conducting human health risk assessments. So how does that background shape your initial reaction to Florida's reported arsenic findings in confectionery products?
Sure, that's a great question. Now, let me ask a quick question to you back. Do you have kids?
I don't, but
Okay.
I know, most people do, so they're probably
No, that's
concerned
fine.
about
No, I
these
mean,
things,
I'm sure
right?
you probably know some parents who probably have kids. And, when the general public kind of sees this information about something that's in their kids' products, whether it's a food product or a toy or something like that, people get upset about it. And if they don't have that knowledge, they get reactionary. They say, "Oh my God, what's going on?" And I look at this and I help shape my thinking, and I help shape others as best I can and say, listen, there's ways that these data can be interpreted. There's processes to go through on risk assessment and understanding what hazards are and what risks are. So that background assists me to understand I have 2 kids, what I'll feel like could safely give my kids versus explaining to other people why I may or may not be concerned about something in a product like arsenic or whatever it may be. I do also, I'll say, product safety assessments on other products, and I'll say whether, I'm concerned about it or I don't really have concerns based on the data. And it very much comes down to what the data looks like and how to interpret that data from, as you said, the exposure science standpoint.
And, in reviewing the Healthy Florida First data that's been highlighted in this recent coverage, what specific gaps in testing methodology or data reporting or transparency do you think make the findings kind of difficult to interpret from a scientific standpoint?
When this first, I'll say, came out in January and February this year, there were a lot of unknowns. It seemed like a media blitz on looking at kind of sensationalization of data and saying, look what we found, and making this I don't want to say a bigger deal than it is, but a big deal without context. And there's been some, I'll say, updates on information that the Florida Department of Health has released, but overall, there's lots of missing information. When I look at doing assessments, I want to understand the entire process from selection of the material through the risk assessment process. I don't know how these materials were selected. The Florida Department of Health says something to the effect of, these products now recently it said this they get it from multiple retailers and online locations. You get different manufacturing batches and lot numbers. That information wasn't released initially. With, how many samples did they run? I don't know how many they looked at. There's a data gap there. The data and reporting, I don't know what the data looks like from the lab report. If it's easy data, they say that they're following laboratory standards. Great. Release the lab reports. Let us see it. Let other people who are used to this see the data itself. Even the layman can let you look at it, and because there's usually a summary in there. So the transparency make it difficult from the data reporting side and the methodology. What equations did you use? What inputs did you use? Again, the frequently asked questions that they have recently put out kind of generally touch on subjects, but they still don't give the basic information and requirements for understanding how the assessments were done, who decided what inputs to use, how those inputs were applied, and how different input parameters may change the outcome. Sometimes in science, we refer to this as a sensitivity analysis. If we use these inputs, we may get this output X, but if we use these other inputs, we'll get output Y. Why are there differences? What do the differences look like? And is the actual number somewhere in the middle between X and Y?
Interesting. And, looking at this from a toxicology perspective, how is arsenic typically evaluated in food and consumer products? And, what kind of context is necessary to determine whether detected levels are even meaningful for human health?
There are a variety of methods that are out there. And what you would like a laboratory to do is typically start a basis using a standard method that's been approved by, I'll say, by a regulatory agency, by FDA or EPA or someone. And labs are known, and they can do this following their internal standards and procedures and auditing requirements, are following or they may be modifying those methods to better fit the scenarios. So if you look at the laboratory, they say we run, I'll just say, FDA method or whatever method it is, but they'll say a modified method. And if they have some kind of modification to a method, they'll explain the rationale. They'll explain how they get there. So you can backtrack and saying, okay, that makes sense why they did that. Maybe they've run into issues with, I'll say, what we call a matrix, and before say, well, we can't analyze that matrix using this method. We've modified it so we can do that. And there's lots of things laboratories do. I don't have a lab. I've worked in labs, but they use standards and they run standards and they compare them to curves, and they'll do something called spiking the material, saying we'll put it in a known concentration and see if we can recover that concentration within this tolerance level. And it all depends on what the intended use is of that material. For example, if you're looking at a food product, there are, I'll say, food analytical methods that are out there for looking at maybe heavy metals that are in foods. Finding out what the Florida Department of Health did was very difficult. When I was searching this up, there was a quote in a news story from someone that purportedly was from the Florida Department of Health, FDOH, and said, well, we use this EPA method. And on their FAQs, they say, oh, yes, this test follow US EPA methods. Well, if you look at the EPA method, and the one that they're quoted in the news is using is for soil matrices. So it's not a food source, it's for something that's an environmental source. So I think it all depends on what you're using the material for and how you're using the data. For example, if I'm going to use a product, do something for product safety assessments, and your listeners may or may not be aware of this, certain regulatory agencies require things for, I'll say, if it's a medical device or something implanted in your body, there's standards, there's ISO standards that you have to, I'll say, follow. But there also, and I've worked with some of these, there are brands that if you're selling something associated with the brand identity, they have their own set of safety parameters that you have to follow on understanding, let's just say it's and I'm just throwing random things out there. It's a phone case. And you want to make sure that if you're holding your phone case all day, which way too many of us probably do, that nothing is coming out of that phone case that could get onto your hands. So they do these studies to determine whether or not soaking the phone case in something that's going to mimic sweat may release anything from that material onto your hand. And there's methods and ways to do that. So it's applicable to the scenario that is being evaluated. So if they're using potentially an EPA method for environmental, I'll say soil matrix to apply to food, that makes maybe interpreting the data more difficult because I mean there are certain issues or diseases that are the people want to eat dirt. That's a whole nother story and scenario. But are you getting the data that you need based on the method that's being used? And there's probably better methods that are out there to use. But again, if there was a modification at the laboratory that said, hey, we had to use this method because it's the most sensitive methods, the one that helps us get the best resolution, understanding it based on a digestion of the material or whatever it is, then it should be explained in a report, it should be explained in an audit. And the fact that that's information is not released makes me, I don't want to say suspect of the data, but it makes me very much want to question what those data actually mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Now, you've emphasized that detection alone doesn't equate to danger. Now, can you walk us through the difference between hazard identification and risk assessment and why that distinction is so critical in this case?
I'll take this a step further and back. And this is always a difficult, I'll say, challenging conversation to have. Because when people hear hazards, they hear risks, and they tend to use them synonymously, saying, oh, they're interchangeable, when they're actually not. So hazard is generally a theoretical kind of idea that something can be harmful at any amount. So I think it's important to remember, and this is important context, is something hazardous. They say hazardous material. Well, many things can be hazardous. And I'll explain that a little more in a second. When you think of risk is the amount of, I'll say, quantifying the amount of hazard associated with something based on a lot more, I'll say, parameters, exposure parameters, what we refer to as dose, the amount that gets into your body, how it interacts with the body. There's lots of things. So when you think of hazards and dose or risk assessment, everybody says, oh, well, things are hazardous, but people don't realize that if water is something that's essential for life, water can be hazardous. You can actually take in too much water in a 24-hour period and essentially drown yourself by drinking it. So it's important to recognize that just because something is a hazard doesn't mean it's an actual, what we call human health risk driver. Say that, just because it's detecting something doesn't mean that our bodies can't handle it. Like water, our bodies require water. If we have too much water, we visit the bathroom too often. If we have way too much water, then that obviously ends up a problem. But it's like in this scenario of arsenic, our bodies can handle a certain amount of exposure to lots of things. Again, arsenic here. Our bodies know how to deal with it. We know how to eliminate it. The whole point of getting something in our body is our body wants to get it out when it's not supposed to be there. So it's important to realize that when you're assessing risk from the arsenic or whatever it is, there's lots of parameters that go into beyond just saying something is a hazard. You need to understand if it's an actual risk or risk driver. And that's an important distinction that a lot of people don't seem to want to explain well from the public health perspective. And the person that's a parent is going to say, what does that matter to me? So having the explanation, I think, is always crucial.
Yeah, I think, the context is really important here, and certainly the communication about risk is so important. Now, looking at, this example of arsenic in candy, what types of exposure assumptions and risk calculations are normally required to translate, the results you get from contaminant testing into a realistic assessment of consumer risk?
When there's lots of different equations out there. So what we do is we do modeling. We say, okay, these are modeled parameters on lots of different, I'll say, some assumptions. They could be, as long as they have validation behind the assumptions, they go into these model parameters, and then we can model what our risks are. So we look at a few things. So as I mentioned before, and this is going to be crucial and probably discussions further, is there's four main parts to a risk assessment. So the hazard identification, we've already talked about identifying a hazard. The next two are exposure assessment and toxicological or dose response assessment. So when you're looking at evaluating this, you want to know what the exposure parameters are. You want to say, okay, well, if you think about water, when you're doing risk assessments, there's generally, and this is, I'll say, it's beyond just the environmental exposure. There's a document that EPA puts out. It's called the Exposure Factors Handbook, and it talks about how people are exposed, what they are exposed to as far as, I'll say, intake parameters. So one of them is discussing, intake of water per day. So generally they have all these studies and they summarize them and they say, listen, individuals take in, I'll just put it out there, an average of 2 liters a day of water. Now, it's important that there's a distinction there because it's 2 liters a day for everybody, or is it 2 liters a day for certain populations? And if you look at it, it'll say, well, adults probably take in a higher volume of water than kids. So you want to understand, okay, well, are the exposure parameters they're evaluating, did they use a general adult and kid kind of average? Did they use the adult value, or did they use the kid value for water intake, or whatever intake you're concerned with? What weight did they use in their parameters? Because usually when you look at something as far as dose, it's usually a concentration milligram per kilogram body weight. So arsenic in the milligrams and body weight in the kilograms. So did they use an adult? Did they use weight? Did they use a teen weight? Did they use a child weight? All these parameters go into understanding what the exposures potentially could have been. And the fact that those are not being reported anywhere other than, again, and I point out to the Florida Department of Health having these frequently asked questions they recently put out. They just said, how is the risk evaluated? They just randomly just mentioned EPA, EFSA, European Food Safety Authority, ATSDR, and other default exposure factors. But that doesn't help me understand what their inputs were in their equations. So not having that information is difficult to translate into a risk, because as someone who does this, I want to see what your inputs were, because sometimes they're open for discussion. You can say, well, it doesn't make sense that you're using that one. Let's discuss why and support why. Whenever I'm doing a risk assessment, I say, I use this value because it made sense for the scenario that I was evaluating, as opposed to, well, these are just the default ones we figured out and fall back to, but I don't even know which default ones they used.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And, speaking of how the federal agencies typically structure exposure science and toxicological risk assessments for contaminants in food, how do they do that? Like the FDA, the EPA, and how does that compare then to what's been shared in this case?
Sure. And, as I was alluding to, if I'm doing a risk assessment for a state agency or a federal agency, they want to see everything explained out. They want to see, what all my inputs were, why I chose them. And interestingly enough, and I don't think this has changed recently, but, if you're looking at FDA may say, okay, we're going to assume an individual 60 kilograms, whereas the EPA is going to say we're going to assume an individual adult is 80 kilograms. That could have an impact on what the risk is. So which risk level did they use? All that is typically explained very plainly when these, I'll say, if you have to submit a risk assessment for an environmental cause, or if you're doing something, there's some stuff that you do for FDA from the food side, from the CIFSAN side, is, if you're doing a generally recognized as safe or GRAS determination, or if you're using a food additive petition or something, that stuff is explained in there. This is what we did. This is what our assumptions were. This is our toxicological basis for why we chose this threshold. And the fact that, again, that it's this FAQ from Florida Department of Health is a page and a half. If you've seen GRAS notifications, if you've seen these submissions for food additive petitions, they're 100 pages long. if you look at risk assessments for EPA, they could be 100, 200, 500 pages long, depending on how many sites there are or what data evaluation they did. The fact that this is not released and not available just, it pales in comparison to what's typically done. And again, it should be easy for them to release this. And I don't know why they have it, but they just, they're very hush hush, which always makes me, when someone's hush hush with the data, always makes me go, why? So.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting question. Now, kind of looking at this issue and the concerns that we're raising in this interview. So, in your view, how can incomplete or selectively presented data unintentionally distort public understanding or elevate concerns, particularly when it involves contaminants like heavy metals in foods?
And again, this goes back to the laboratory question: is what was done at the lab? How did they evaluate that? So, for example, one portion of what I do is I'm adjunct faculty at the University of South Florida College of Public Health. So we've got some research going on using some secondary data from NHANES, which any of your readers may or listeners may or may not be aware is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. We're looking at arsenic data and childhood, I'll say, growth outcomes to see if there are any associations or not with any of those. But when you look at that data from NHANES, and this is important context, is non-detect from a laboratory doesn't mean non-detect. Non-detect from a laboratory means that based on their internal standards and internal requirements, they just couldn't detect it at the levels they have set. Typically, people refer to these as the reporting limit or a limit of detection or limit of quantification, and all those have slightly different meanings. If I look at NHANES data, they report and they say, listen, we report this data as, the limit of detection divided by the square root of 2, which is kind of a standard methodology for saying, listen, we're going to say that there is some amount there, we just can't see it, but we're err on the side of caution to say, listen, when you're evaluating this data, this is how you need to evaluate it and show that, even though it was not detect, we're assuming that there's a small amount in there. I don't see the state of Florida did this. They just say in their data is to say it's non-detect. I don't know what non-detect means. Non-detect can even vary between laboratories. So, I don't know if the lab that they use, because they talk about the standards, ISO standards, which is kind of a traceability requirement. I don't know if they use the same laboratory. There can be interlaboratory variations, and say their limit of detection may be higher than another laboratory where all the samples done at the same lab at the same time, but they're sent different places, different reporting limits. So, when you look at those things and then say, well, why isn't that available for me to look at? It makes me question it, and it kind of distorts things. It says, well, I don't know what those levels actually mean. Is that actually non-detect? And conversely, for the detections, it goes back to the discussion. What did the data actually mean? Did they, how did they evaluate the sample? Did they, I'll just say it's a little piece of candy or whatever it is, a Skittle or whatever. I say Skittle generally, just a small little circle candy. Did they look at one Skittle? Did they put the whole pack in there and homogenize it? Did they mix it all together? Was it based on one piece of candy with the whole bag, a few samples from the bag? We have no idea. And that kind of distorts things also. You're like, when they say, oh, you should limit your ingestion of these, and I'm trying to look at it right now, and limit your ingestion of candy or this particular candy to, 3 bags a year or 16 pieces. Oh, they're looking at gummies and stuff, But what does that mean? Was that, again, based on a per piece? Did they look at multiple pieces from multiple bags? It almost biases without the context. It biases what they're reporting. So then people say, well, what does that mean? Because in the important context here, arsenic is found naturally in nature. It's everywhere. And there are food products. If you think about there's FDA regulations or at least notifications for having rice. If you're talking about, I'll say, root vegetables or something that's grown in soil, it could uptake anything from the soil, including arsenic. So, it used to be, and I don't know if this is much now, sweet potatoes used to have a high amount of arsenic. Rice has a high amount of arsenic. The apples could as well. So, there are, it's not unique to candy. having arsenic in there or anything, which is why, there's obviously a push to want to analyze the food products. And also importantly, and I bring this up also, is, often food manufacturers have internal standards, or I'll say specifications that they follow and say, listen, we're going to analyze our own products and we're going to, set our tolerances at these levels based on our own risk assessments. And there's no indication that, the Florida DOH reached out to any of these manufacturers and said, hey, what are your internal tolerances? How do our numbers compare to yours? It doesn't, it gives a distorted view because, and typically the manufacturer's information is not released. It's more so for their internal standards. But, you know, if that data, if the manufacturer's data is an order of magnitude or two orders of magnitude, 10 times or 100 times lower than what the FDOH is saying, I think that information is important to get out there and get ahead of, because somebody's going to go, why are there such vast differences? And I think that will help with the public's view of what these numbers may mean in context.
Now, given that context is so important when we talk about this, and you need those specific data points to understand the context, what do you think are some best practices that regulators and public health authorities should be following when they're communicating things like contaminant testing results? And, with the view that that information is accurate and transparent and also responsibly interpreted by both the industry and consumers.
Yeah, and I'm gonna challenge you and your listeners a little bit, because I want, I always love feedback. They're good or bad, give me feedback. I'd love to hear from your listeners, and they can reach out to you or me, or I don't care. Tell me what you want to know. Tell me what will help you understand when data like this come out, because there are, I'll say, guidance documents for how agencies should deal with risk communication. Risk communication is super important, because if you're not communicating your risk efficiently and effectively, then why are you even communicating in the first place? When you want someone to distill this down to I want to say the simplest terms, with the terms that are most easily digestible, I want to know what people want to know. Do they want to know, is it safe for me? Some kind, that may be a dichotomous yes or no. That may be give me more details than I need to know so I can make my own informed decision, because people may make their own risk assessment. They say, listen, I'm not, going out in a huge science route of doing these equations. I want to know what, inputs are out there for me to make my own choices, pretty much. And I think that the information that Florida Department of Health, I think it's a good goal to do. But if you're not releasing all the information out there for effectively communicating any kind of contaminants, that for people to make their own decisions, then you're not doing anyone a service. If I am going to, and again, I mentioned this earlier, if I'm going to do assessments, you're going to know every decision, why I made that decision. And, sometimes, again, I said, well, based on this input, we'll use this, or based on this one, we'll use the other one, based on site parameters. Intake may vary between different regions of the United States, where, I've seen those maps of, favorite sodas or favorite candies or whatever in different states. And you may say, well, that's not applicable here. We use more of this one, or we sell more of this one. So, there are effective risk communication tools that are out there, and a lot of agencies do follow them. But when they don't follow them, and I think that what we're doing here is appropriate, is holding them accountable on why they're not following them and what they need to do to follow them, and hopefully get that data released for future information. Because I'm sure even people in industry going, what are they talking about with these data? It doesn't make any sense, especially, as I mentioned earlier, if they go to look at their own internal data and it looks nothing like it. It's like comparing apples to oranges. They use different methods, that they didn't do it I'll say, sample in a normal manner. It makes the data almost uninterpretable. So when you're looking at things from transparency and responsibility, you have to understand that not only is getting that data point out there the responsible thing, but explaining what it means in an effective communication is also vital to the end user.
Yeah, absolutely. And, along with that, I think communication, knowing which audience you're speaking to, because, if you're talking directly to industry versus consumers, like industry, they can take the science and the more data, but consumers need it distilled down a little bit. What does it mean for you? What does it mean when you're standing at the grocery store trying to decide what to buy and if something is okay to give to your kids, right?
Right. That's exactly it. I'll have people reach out to me and be like, oh, are you still letting your kids have this? And I was like, I'm not concerned because I don't see that the data are there to concern me because I don't know what these data mean.
Right.
Yeah. Maybe there is some validity to it. Explain it. Tell me why it's valid. Go through it. Like you said, in industry, sure, you're going to be talking to people who do this all the time. These industry folks are going to be able to say, and I'm sure they have, and I think I've seen some articles that say, well, what do these data mean? But when you're making a decision in the store, whether you should buy, a hard sweet candy versus chocolate, be like, well, Florida Department of Health says I shouldn't have this, or my kids shouldn't have this. And, are you going to leave a crying kid in the store because they're letting them have something from data that makes no sense? So, yeah, I mean, it does have to be distilled down, but still you have to understand that you have to talk to people so they understand it. Don't talk. And I hate to say this, don't talk down to people. Talk to them on in a way that they're going to understand it, whether it's using an analogy or something else that's going to help them, I'll say, absorb that information so you're not talking over their head.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you, Alex, for being on the podcast today. This discussion has been really interesting. And I think, it will be interesting to see if there's any more clarification on this data that has been released, if Florida will come out with, a little bit more context or background for the methods that they used in this case, looking at arsenic in candy. So thanks for shedding some light on this issue. I think this is really valuable information for our listeners to have.
Sure. I'm happy to help, and I appreciate you having me on.
Thanks again to Dr. Alex LeBeau for joining us on the podcast today. And of course, thanks to all of you for listening. Now, we love hearing from you. So please don't hesitate to send us any questions or suggestions to podcast@food-safety.com or post a note on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, or Instagram. We're always happy to hear your feedback. And to make sure that new and bonus episodes magically appear in your podcast player, all you have to do is click that follow or subscribe button in the player of your choice, and presto, bingo, all the episodes appear. 200 and many, many, manys, right? And while you're there, please throw some stars our way by rating the podcast, especially if you enjoyed it. It only takes a moment, and it's good for everyone. And that's it for us today. Our next regular episode will post on July 28th. In the meantime, take good care of yourselves and those around you, and we'll talk to you then.